Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Cold and dark life inside a medieval castle. In the romantic imagination of many, a medieval castle is a place of gallant knights, graceful princesses, and lavish banquets beneath sparkling chandeliers. But the truth is far gloomier. Behind the magnificent exterior lies a world that is cold, dark, and brutally harsh. Imagine you are someone living in a 13th century medieval castle. Winter has arrived. Cutting winds sweep across the open fields and pour through every crack in the stone walls, which are often meters thick. Despite the castle's solid appearance, it retains little warmth. Its primary building material, stone, absorbs the cold and releases it back into the already freezing air at night. There is no heating system, no glass windows, no way to block out the cold. When the sun sets, the entire castle is plunged into darkness. Electricity has not yet been invented. Candles or torches are the only sources of light, but their glow is weak and flickering, as if struggling for life in the thick air. The pale yellow of candlelight only illuminates a small area, making every corridor, corner, and staircase appear ghostly and full of shadows. Human silhouettes stretch and distort on the walls, making anyone walking alone at night easily fall into fear. In the great halls, often called the main halls, the atmosphere is no better. High ceilings and wide spaces allow the heat from any fireplace to dissipate quickly. Most castles only have a few fireplaces, located in important places such as the dining hall, the Lord's chamber, or the chapel. Servants or guards often have to endure the cold throughout the night, relying only on thick wool cloaks and some straw on the floor as their fragile shelter. The wind howling through cracks sounds like the wailing of lost souls. And the smell, that is an inescapable part of the castle experience. With primitive sanitation, the air was often filled with foul odors. Waste was disposed of through chutes that emptied directly into moats or nearby ditches. There were no bathrooms as we know them today. People bathed only a few times a year, and it was considered a luxury. The food mainly consisted of dark bread, salted meat, and thin soups. In winter, fresh produce was nearly non-existent. Turnips, dried onions, and smoked fish were all that remained after the autumn harvest. The somber atmosphere made every meal feel more like a ritual of survival than a source of joy. Yet it was within this harshness that medieval people found ways to survive. Thick tapestries were hung on the walls, not for decoration, but for insulation. Beds were designed with heavy curtains on all four sides, creating a small box that retained body heat. On the coldest nights, servants would sleep close together to share body warmth. There was nothing strange or shameful about it. It was simply a means of survival. In the castle's basement, where wine and dried food were stored, the temperature could drop so low that one's breath became visible mist. Those who were punished were often imprisoned in stone dungeons. These were places of frigid hell. No light, no blankets, no words. Only the sound of dripping water and the moans of the forgotten. Not just physically, the cold seeped into the spirit. The outside world was always full of danger. Bandits, plagues, religious wars, inquisitions. Inside the castle, life was no more peaceful. A servant could be punished simply for spilling a cup of wine. Women were seen as possessions, used for marriage, childbirth, or as ornaments to male power. Children, even those of lords, were subject to harsh rules from a young age, learning how to wield a knife, how to bow, how to hide their tears. Darkness was not just the absence of light, but the absence of hope. Perhaps what terrified people most was not the cold stone or the howling wind, but the isolation. Medieval castles were often located in remote places, on hilltops or deep in forests, difficult to reach. Each winter, the world seemed to freeze. No one went out, no one came in. News from the outside might take weeks, even months to arrive. A sudden death from illness, accident, or murder could go unnoticed until the snow melted. Yet in that darkness, there was still light. Small but resilient. There were winter nights when people gathered around a fire, told fairy tales, played crude instruments, and sang folk songs. In chapels, the flickering of candlelight and the voices raised in ritual offered a moment of warmth to the soul, and on the walls, faded paintings of saints, worn by time, remained as reminders that there is something higher than kings and frost: faith. Life in a medieval castle was no fairy tale. It was survival under harsh conditions where every day lived was a victory. It was a place where a servant might have to choose between loyalty and life, where a child was born already burdened by family legacy, and where a woman had to find a way to hold on to her dignity in a world that only saw her worth through marriage. When we sit in a modern room cooled by air conditioning, bathed in soft light with hot water at our fingertips, it's hard to imagine how people once lived. But perhaps it is because they endured that today's world could emerge from the dark into the light. The darkness behind stone walls, the haunting called the toilet. If bone-chilling cold and suffocating darkness made stone corridors terrifying, perhaps nothing was more haunting than the necessary place. Or more accurately, what passed for a toilet in medieval times. No porcelain seats, no clean flush of water, no private doors to close, just a crude stone projection cut out of the castle wall, a hole that opened directly above a moat or deep ravine. No one called it comfort. It was merely a compromise with the demands of survival. Medieval people had no concept of privacy as we understand it today. When someone entered the latrine, a name far more refined than reality, they had to squat, fully exposed, in the biting wind that cut through cracks in the walls above a stream of waste collecting from hundreds of other people in the castle. The stench was constant. There was no sophisticated drainage system, no clean water for rinsing, only a deep pit where everything was dumped, and the hope that the moat's water flow would be strong enough to wash some of it away. But in winter, the water froze. Everything accumulated, and from there, the scent of death spread throughout the castle. In large castles, there might be several such privies, usually built adjacent to exterior walls so that waste would fall directly outside, away from living quarters. But in most cases, a single small alcove served dozens of people. They had to take turns, often lining up, waiting, regardless of time, cold, or illness. For women, this inconvenience became torment. No sanitary cloths, no warm water, no minimal privacy. Menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum all took place in brutally harsh conditions. Many women suffered infections, dying quietly, not from war or famine, but simply from being unable to maintain basic hygiene. Servants endured the worst. They had no right to use the elevated toilets reserved for the nobility. They had to go to the edges of the castle walls or down to the kitchen quarters, where a crude drainage trench existed. Sometimes, all they had was a wooden bucket, which they had to carry and empty themselves, often in the dead of night, wind howling, barefoot on frozen stone floors, with the waste of both themselves and their masters sloshing on their backs. In some residential areas around castles, people simply threw waste into the streets, out the window, accompanied by a feeble warning cry in Old French, "Garde à l'eau," watch out for the dirty water. If you weren't careful, you might step outside your house and immediately be drenched by someone else's skyfall. Medieval cities were places where stench was ever present. The smell of dead animals, half-cured hides, rotting food, and unwashed humans who hadn't bathed all winter. But above all, the smell of urine and human feces was inescapable. It seeped into fabrics, curtains, hair, and memory. Disease came uninvited. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and especially the Black Death, the plague, all stemmed from poor sanitation. People didn't understand bacteria. They believed it was God's punishment, a poisonous miasma from the earth, or a curse from witches. No one knew that the very latrine they used daily was the birthplace of catastrophe. However, amid all that chaos, there were still efforts, clumsy but noteworthy, to maintain hygiene. Medieval people used dried herbs to mask odors, such as rosemary, lavender, or mint. They placed leaves around toilet areas to repel flies. In wealthier places, cloth rags were used instead of toilet paper, but those rags were rarely washed, usually just dried and reused, making things even worse. On stormy nights when leaving the room wasn't possible, people used a chamber pot, a small container placed under the bed. Come morning, the servants had to dispose of them. This task was often left to orphans, slaves, or the lowest class. In society's eyes, cleaning waste symbolized a degraded status. Without toilets, people easily lost their sense of humanity. When one has no proper place to attend to such basic needs, a part of their dignity is stripped away. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, they had no choice. They simply held it in, endured, and eventually got sick and died silently. Yet in that world, people still tried to live. They still loved, gave birth, lit candles in the dark, and sang lullabies beside damp beds. They weren't used to demanding comfort, because there was no comfort to know or to ask for. Sanitation wasn't just a physiological issue, it was one tied to power. A lord might sit on a stone toilet with a roof overhead and a servant to clean up after. Meanwhile, peasants, laborers, and soldiers had to relieve themselves behind a tree, by a wall, or simply wherever seemed okay. In a society where even going to the toilet was dictated by class, true justice could never exist. It's astonishing to think that what we now take for granted, like a clean toilet, was once a distant dream for centuries. And that dream was paid for by millions of lives, by plagues, by wars, and by years swallowed in darkness. Beyond the cold hallways and stench-filled privy holes, life in a medieval castle had another harsh reality: unsafe food, a term that sounds modern but was an ancient dread. In that era, with no electricity, no knowledge of microbiology, and certainly no refrigerators, eating and surviving the meal was almost a gamble, when food was a trophy against time. Step into the great kitchen of a medieval castle, and you wouldn't find stainless steel counters, no coolers, and certainly no clean water from a tap. Instead, there was heat, smoke, straw, and the smell of rotting meat. Fresh food, if available, lasted only a very short time. A freshly slaughtered chicken would keep for just one day. Pork, lamb, or beef, if not salted until dry as stone, would rot within a few days, especially in the summer. Salt was used as a savior, but it was a double-edged sword. Too much salt turned meat as hard as wood, stripped it of flavor, and if not soaked again in water, could cause severe dehydration or digestive disorders. But if soaked too long, the meat would soften, and with it came the pungent stench of decomposition. Some types of meat, like fish, were soaked in brine so strong they could emit a foul odor even before the storage barrel was opened. In fact, medieval people often considered the smell of rot normal. As long as it was boiled thoroughly and spiced, it could be eaten. And because there was no knowledge of bacterial toxins like Clostridium botulinum or Salmonella, many people suffered from severe food poisoning without ever knowing why. Spices, the subtle deception of the ancient kitchen. In grand castles, cooks often tried to mask the stench with expensive spices like nutmeg, pepper, dried ginger, or cinnamon. This wasn't to make food taste better, but to deceive the nose and conceal decay. A piece of pork that had become unnaturally soft would be mixed with vinegar, honey, and mustard seeds. A foul-smelling fish would be charred on the outside and covered with dried herbs. The strong, pungent taste made it hard to detect anything unusual, or if one did, they wouldn't dare say it. Among the nobility, the feast would still proceed with grandeur, but behind the silk tablecloth were dishes that had lived in salt boxes, fermented in smoke, and rotted in wooden barrels. The luxury was merely a thin mask over a horrifying reality. The slow death named dinner. In old chronicles, it's not rare to find faint records of days when royalty fell ill after a feast, what today would clearly be understood as food poisoning. Common symptoms: severe diarrhea, vomiting, high fever, dehydration, and in many cases, death within a few days. But no one knew why. They blamed bad winds, demons, or curses from witches, while the true cause was an overly salted bird or a fish gone bad for 2 weeks. It wasn't just the nobles, servants, guards, and common folk around the castle suffered even more. They had no access to fresh meat or spices. Their food consisted of thin porridge, moldy bread, old turnips, and broth made from bone scraps. But even bread, the symbol of life, was not safe. Moldy bread and toxic spores. Grains in the medieval period were prone to mold due to lack of proper storage. A type of fungus called Claviceps purpurea, found in rye, produced a toxin known as ergot, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and in many cases, gangrene in the limbs. A moldy loaf of bread could make an entire family fall ill, not because the gods were angry, but because they had just eaten a colorless, odorless, tasteless poison. There are even records of entire villages going mad, with people screaming, convulsing, and throwing themselves into fire, now believed by historians to be cases of mass ergot poisoning. Water. Unsafe and unclean. Another danger lurked in a simple cup of water. Medieval people rarely drank plain water, not because they understood bacteria, but because experience had taught them it could kill. Wells in castles were often contaminated by human waste, meat washing runoff, or simply by the flow from high-level toilets draining downward. So to be safer, people drank beer, a light, low-alcohol kind, even children. Beer was brewed with boiled water, so it was somewhat cleaner, but it wasn't truly healthy. That's why in old engravings, even 3-year-olds are shown raising their mugs. Meals were survival, not pleasure. Compared to what we know today, meals rich in fresh vegetables, clean water, and safe meat. Eating in the Middle Ages was a test of endurance. People didn't eat for joy or experience. They ate to avoid starving and prayed not to die from what they just swallowed. The saying, "You are what you eat," had never been more true. Because when food was rotting flesh disguised with spices and water came from a trench of sewage, death needed no sword. It was already on the table. Under cold stones and above the smell of rotting meat, people still lived. And yet, amidst scarcity, biting cold, and spoiled food, medieval people still lived. They still loved, still bore children, still held weddings, still feasted on rare occasions. That resilience, the art of living in hardship, is what makes that dark era worth remembering, not merely as a chapter in history, but as a lesson in endurance. In our imagination, a medieval castle often comes with grand halls, solid stone walls, and tall canopied beds draped in silk. A place where nobles live in peace, shielded from the chaos outside, served dutifully by loyal attendants. But like all beautiful legends, the truth is always barer. The truth is, in most medieval castles, the concept of private rooms did not exist. Living spaces were not divided by walls, but by status. And even high status did not guarantee a quiet corner in this crowded and cold world. Nobles had no private rooms, only priority for beds. In a typical castle, nobles, be they lords or ladies, did not have a true private room. The main room, often called the Great Chamber or Solar, served as a space to rest, work, receive guests, hold meetings, and even give birth. And when guests arrived, especially important ones, the lord and lady of the castle would give up their bed and sleep elsewhere. Elsewhere meant sleeping alongside servants, guards, scribes, attendants, and sometimes even strangers. There were no barriers between the powerful and the serving. Each person might have only a straw mattress laid out on cold stone floors, and if lucky, a thin curtain, not for privacy, but to block the wind. One room, 20 people, daily life in a castle. For common folk, sleeping conditions were already poor. But in the castle, where one might expect luxury, it was a nightmare of crowding. A 20 square meter room could house up to 10 people sleeping together. Servants slept at the foot of the master's bed, guards near the doors, maids laid straw close to the fire to keep warm. Whoever found space slept there. No locked doors, no silence, no private space to change clothes, write a letter, or simply breathe. Snoring, teeth grinding, groans from stomach aches, the sting of insect bites, all wove together into the chaotic symphony of a medieval night. And for the female servants, this was a constant fear. No private room meant the constant risk of abuse, being watched, being forced, and no one would speak up because there was nowhere to hide and no one truly cared. Each night was a gamble of survival. Master, guest, servant, stranger, all under one roof. In the spirit of medieval hospitality, a guest was seen as a symbol of honor, whether they were an envoy, merchant, monk, or wandering knight. And so the noble household was obligated to host, not just with meals, but with sleeping quarters, living space, and even servants. Imagine you're a lord just returned from a long journey. Your familiar room has been taken over by an emissary from Normandy. His servant sleeps in the kitchen quarters, while his guards lie scattered across the hallways. You can't order them to leave. Your reputation depends on your hospitality. All you can do is retreat to a corner of the stairwell, clutch your cloak, and try to sleep amidst coughing and the stench of unwashed bodies. Shared space, the nightmare of togetherness. In a setting without privacy, all secrets are vulnerable, all emotions exposed. There is no place to cry alone, no place to write a diary, no place to grieve or to celebrate in solitude. Even illness had nowhere to hide. Someone injured, feverish, or suffering from a contagious disease still lay in the same room as the healthy. No one thought of quarantine, simply because there was no room for it. And the result was contagion. Lice, fleas, scabies, fungus, they were all uninvited neighbors. One morning, you might wake up with blisters passed on by someone sleeping half a meter away, or worse, with a plague caught from a stranger who happened to pass through the castle the day before. private room, space, freedom, three luxuries in the dark. Today, a private room is the bare minimum in every modern home. A child can have a room to study, an adult can close the door to rest. But in the Middle Ages, even kings and queens didn't have such private spaces. Forced proximity eroded the human psyche. Without a place to think, to be alone with oneself, to maintain necessary distance in relationships, people were easily drawn into violence, suspicion, and mental collapse. It's no surprise that many medieval people, especially women, sought refuge in monasteries. Not just for faith, but because there they were allowed to have a small room, a tile's space to sleep, a quiet corner to pray, a closed space to breathe. All is one, a borderless space. Consider the whole picture. When the cold seeps through every crack in the wall, the toilet is a lidless hole, the food smells of spoiled meat, and now you have no private corner to exist. Survival becomes an endless trial. Medieval space had no physical borders, only class borders. A noble might get a thicker mattress, a servant might lie closer to the hearth, but no one had the right to shut a door and be alone. Even sleep, the last sacred thing, was shared, invaded, crowded, and in that crowding, one had to either harden or break. In the medieval world, where the food was rotten, the toilet a gaping hole in a stone wall, and privacy a luxury, noblewomen faced a pressure heavier than any physical hardship, the duty to bear children. Not out of maternal love, not to build a family, but to protect bloodlines, preserve power, and ensure property stayed within reach. From as young as 13 or 14, a noble girl was seen as a carefully nurtured vessel for reproduction, to be married off not by her own choice, but by her parents' will, for the benefit of the entire family. When a woman's primary function was the womb, no noblewoman of that era could escape the duty of childbearing. From the moment of marriage, she entered a brutal biological race. The sooner she bore children, the better. The first child had to be a boy. The second son was a spare. The others could be girls, used as tools for political marriage with other noble families. With each year that passed without pregnancy, the woman endured suspicious glances, whispered gossip, and at times humiliating coldness from her own husband. Infertility equaled failure. No one asked why, no one blamed the man. The entire burden rested on the wife's shoulders. Care? Yes, but not enough to survive. Even within the walls of a castle, attended by servants and nourished with fresh meat and warm milk, noblewomen were not protected from dying in childbirth. On the contrary, the more pregnancies, the higher the risk of death. There was no concept of sterility. No obstetricians, no antibiotics. Midwives relied mainly on inherited knowledge. Many believed in magic, prayers, or wearing talismans to ward off evil. If the baby was breech, if the bleeding wouldn't stop, if the placenta didn't detach, no one could save the mother. A child might live, but the mother would pass away in silence, often just hours after giving birth, surrounded by the smell of blood, sweat, and someone else's lullaby. The birthing room, not a place of welcome, but a battlefield. Medieval birthing rooms had no delivery beds. The woman either squatted on a wooden stool with a hole in the center or lay on a straw-covered bed. Light came only from flickering candles. The air was thick with the musty stench of blood masked by pungent herbs. Present in the room were the midwife, a few close servants, and a priest, in case the mother died on the spot, so last rites could be performed. Childbirth was not a moment of joy. It was a struggle between life and death. Women were not allowed to scream because it was unbecoming of a lady. They had to endure, grit their teeth, and if they cried, it had to be in silence. Every child is a cut on the mother's body. Noble women often gave birth to 6 to 10 children, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to ensure at least a few would survive. Medicine at the time knew nothing of blood pressure, gestational diabetes, or postpartum hemorrhage. There were no blood tests, no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins or baby formula. Every birth was an invisible incision on a woman's body and soul. Her body weakened with each child. Pelvic bones damaged, uterus inflamed, hair fell out, skin darkened, eyes sank deep. But she still had to get up, manage servants, host guests, teach her children, as if she were a stone statue immune to pain. Dying in the dark. No cry. No word of thanks. There were no hospitals to offer emergency care. If the mother died, her body was rinsed with scented water, dressed in silk, laid on a bed covered with a white cloth and surrounded by candlelight. The husband, if he loved her, might say a prayer, If not, he was already thinking of a second marriage. The baby was carried away. The wife buried quietly. No grand ceremony, no statue was erected, because dying in childbirth was normal. No one was shocked, no one outraged. And when the daughter grows up, it happens again. A noble girl, if she survived illness and malnutrition, would grow up in a castle, learning to sew, embroider, dance, and give birth. From an early age, she knew she would be married off. She knew the name of her future husband before she even knew how to read. At puberty, she was prepared, fed more, taught how to care for her skin, instructed in royal etiquette, but no one asked her if she wanted to marry. No one asked if she was afraid of dying in childbirth, because in medieval society, women were born to reproduce, nothing more, nothing less. Thought she would live like a queen, turned out to be a pawn in a political game. Many think noble women lived more comfortably than peasants. True, they didn't fetch water, plow fields, or sleep under thatched roofs, but the price they paid for that comfort was lifelong surrender of body, of blood, of soul, for the sake of their family. They didn't get to choose their husband, didn't get to choose their profession, didn't get to choose life or death. They only got to choose how to accept it. If you've ever felt uncomfortable stepping into a foul-smelling room or dirty public toilet, imagine the entire medieval castle was an expanded version of that feeling, amplified tenfold, mixed with the scent of blood, sweat, garbage, rotten meat, and urine. There was no real concept of personal hygiene. People didn't bathe daily, sometimes not at all through the winter. There was no disinfectant soap, no toothbrush, no abundant clean water, and no awareness of bacteria. Stench wasn't something foreign. It was part of the air, part of the people, part of the era. Bedbugs, fleas, rats, the silent servants of the castle. In every corner, from bedrooms to kitchens, bedbugs were permanent residents. They hid in straw mattresses, woolen rugs, and the folds of bed curtains. They bit during the night, leaving swollen red patches and an unbearable itch. Medieval people thought it was bad air, unaware that it was a sign of blood-sucking parasites. Fleas lived on the backs of dogs, cats, and even humans. They spread disease without anyone realizing. People at the time believed itching came from bad blood, so they drank herbs or prayed. No one knew the true culprits were those tiny creatures feeding on their blood. Rats were even more obvious. In a castle stocked with grain, cured meat, and great dining halls, rats thrived easily. They scurried across stone floors, crawled into beds, and left droppings everywhere. Worse, they carried fleas infected with the plague, the very ones that killed millions during the Black Death in the 14th century. No bathing, not out of laziness, but fear. Medieval people were afraid of water. They believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed evil spirits and sickness to enter the body. As a result, many bathed only once or twice a year, especially in cold seasons. When forced to clean themselves, they often wiped off with cloths or rosemary. Even nobles fared no better. In many noblewomen's journals of the time, there were mentions of washing their hair with red wine to mask the smell. Some sprinkled fragrant powders into their hair instead of washing it. They weren't trying to be dirty, they simply didn't know cleanliness was possible. The Middle Ages, when smell was identity. In that world, body odor was a marker of social class. Laborers reeked of sweat. Nobles smelled heavily of spices and perfumes, an attempt to cover the truth. Everyone stank. There was no deodorant, no shampoo, no flushing toilets, no clean clothes to change into daily. Clothes were hand-washed, rarely, dried in the sun without detergent, and even clean clothes couldn't save an unclean body. Disease spread like wildfire. In such conditions, disease was inevitable, and once it appeared, it spread so fast that no one could respond in time. There was no disinfection, no masks, no concept of social distancing. A person with a fever would still sleep next to others. Someone with diarrhea still shared the stone latrine with the healthy. A child coughing blood was still carried into the chapel to beg for a blessing. No one understood bacteria, viruses, or parasites. They believed sickness came from sin, witches, or poisonous vapors in the earth. They treated it with herbs, bloodletting, or prayer. But illness spared no one. It didn't care about faith. It didn't care about rank. The Black Death, the ultimate consequence of poor sanitation. In the mid-14th century, the plague, known as the Black Death, swept across Europe. Within a few years, nearly one-third of the continent's population vanished. The dead lay scattered in the streets, in churches, and in castles. The cause? Fleas on rats, rats in houses, people living in filth. A society without hygiene, without isolation, without knowledge. And despite the horrifying death toll, people still didn't know why. They only saw an angry God. They whipped themselves with scourges. They burned those suspected of witchcraft. But no one cleaned the trash. No one chased the rats. No one boiled drinking water. Inside the castle, even death had a stench. Even death was not clean. The dead were not embalmed, not properly prepared. The stench of corpses mixed with the smell of blood, feces, stagnant water, and sweat, forming a breath of death that clung to the stone walls, curtains, bedding. When a family member died, the body often remained in the room for a day or two, sometimes longer if rain prevented burial. Living in a castle without baths, without sanitation, without disinfection, meant that even death couldn't escape filth. Yet amidst the stench, people still tried. Strangely, in such conditions, people still sought to live. They created perfumes. They distilled oils from herbs. They wore scented pouches around their necks to mask their own smell. They sang, they prayed, they told stories. There were women who tried to keep every tablecloth clean, fathers who taught their children to wash their hands with wood ash, monks who warned their students not to eat spoiled meat. Despite ignorance, they still wanted to be better. They did not give in. When people hear medieval nobility, many picture scenes of splendor. Grand castles, banquet tables laden with roasted meats and wine, embroidered fabrics, and glittering golden crowns. But in truth, behind those cold stone walls, the lives of the ruling class were poorer than we imagine. Perhaps even poorer than the peasants outside. Not poor in gold or power, but poor in the essence of human life. Poor in hygiene, poor in freedom, poor in affection, poor in space, poor even in simple joys like a peaceful sleep. Having much, but nothing of one's own. Medieval nobles may have had land, servants, and soldiers, but they had no privacy. Living spaces were shared between masters and servants, between family members and strangers. There were no locked doors. There was no bedroom that truly belonged to anyone. Meanwhile, a poor peasant could live in a small hut with his wife and children, close the door, and they had a private world, however humble and difficult. They could hold their child to sleep without strangers watching. They could hold hands in the kitchen without needing a curtain to hide behind. But the noble had to cry in secret. To speak privately, they had to whisper. To suffer, they had to look composed, because around them were dozens of eyes, dozens of ears, dozens of uninvited footsteps, trapped in their own stone prison. A castle wasn't a home, it was a fortress, cold, hard, dark, and enclosed. The meter-thick walls weren't built to keep warmth in, but to keep enemies out. Yet sometimes the greatest enemy was inside: isolation. The peasant, though burdened with labor and lacking comforts, could breathe the fresh air, watch the sunrise, and talk with neighbors in the fields. They lived close to nature, bathed in streams, lit fires under the open sky, danced during village festivals, and the noble imprisoned in stone. The wind couldn't enter, but neither could sunlight. Songs were stifled. Every gesture was constrained by ceremony. No one truly lived, only performed roles. Luxurious but risky foods. Another irony: peasants ate thin gruel, black bread, and vegetables, simple food but safer, more digestible, and cleaner than the feasts of the nobility. In castles, meat and fish were heavily salted or fermented, smothered in spices to mask the rot. There were no refrigerators, no sanitation checks, and the grander the banquet, the greater the risk of food poisoning. Princes, maids, generals died after meals, and no one knew why. They blamed it on curses. Peasants, though they ate plainly, rarely died from poisoning. They ate what they grew. They knew where it came from. They lived by the seasons and died naturally. No false banquet ever disrupted their biological rhythm. Noble women, beautiful on the outside, broken within. We've spoken about noble women and the pressure to bear children, but behind that was chronic loneliness. A lady lived her whole life to preserve a lineage. She was married off at 14, gave birth until 30, buried her 7th child before turning 35, and died quietly from exhaustion or infection from childbirth. Meanwhile, a peasant woman, though poor, could cook her own meals, teach her children, talk with her husband under the moonlight. They laughed for real, they sang for real, they hurt for real. And though they had no titles, they lived as human beings. When the castle reeked, the peasant bathed in the stream. Sanitation has been explored in earlier sections, but now we must look closer. Nobles were sometimes filthier than peasants. Bathing was rare for both classes. But peasants lived near rivers and streams. They could bathe outdoors. They had wind, sun to dry, and trees to mask odor. Nobles, surrounded by stone, velvet, straw, and servants, everything reeked with no escape. And when rats, lice, and fleas infested their surroundings, not even expensive velvet robes could hide the filth soaking into their skin. Power brings responsibility, but not happiness. As a noble, you must marry the right person. You must maintain appearances. You must manage lands. You must go to war. You must pay taxes to the kingdom. You must please the church. Every action is scrutinized. There is no moment of rest. Not even the simple right to sit quietly, watch the sunset, or eat a piece of cake without pretending. Meanwhile, the peasant, after a day in the fields, can lie beside a pile of straw, eat porridge with his family, and laugh sincerely. No expectations, no chains of tradition, politics, or glory. The only thing more noble than you is your coffin. You might die the same day as a peasant. He is buried behind his cottage, modestly, perhaps mourned by his wife. You are placed in a cold stone tomb, perhaps with a carved statue of your face, a requiem song, a priest saying prayers. But then what? People only remember your child, or the wealth you left behind. You are just a name carved into stone beneath a crumbling castle. When one speaks of hospitality, you may think of offering tea, laying out an extra blanket, or cooking a decent meal to show respect. But if you were a noble living in a castle in the 13th century, hospitality was no longer a choice. It was a social duty, a moral standard, a measure of your family's honor. Refusing a guest, even a stranger, even one who arrived unannounced, even one who stayed for a whole month, could be considered an insult, leading to shame, lost alliances, or even lost political power. So even when you lived in cold, lacked privacy, were exhausted or ill, the lord of the castle still had to smile, still had to give up his bed, still had to pour the wine. And that's when hospitality, seemingly a noble virtue, turned into an invisible chain, binding those already worn down by the weight of their own castle. When guests become masters, one day before sunrise, the guards on the high tower bring word. A band of horsemen is approaching. Their banner marks them as envoys from the north, perhaps friends, perhaps former traitors. You have no right to ask, why are they here, or how long will they stay? You can only prepare to receive them, offer beds, food, servants, and silence when required. Castles had no hotels, no guest rooms, no reservation system. Everyone was assigned a place upon arrival, and the host, even a powerful noble, was expected to vacate his own chamber, surrender his bed to the guests. No one cared if your back ached, if you couldn't sleep, or if you were ill. In cases of many guests, the entire host family might have to move down to the basement, sleeping on straw or cold stone floors, while the guests rested on fur mattresses in heated rooms. That was the proper way. That was tradition. That was what must be done to uphold the family's honor. Not just one night, but sometimes a whole month. Unlike modern times, where guests visit for a few hours and leave, medieval guests might stay for weeks or even months, especially during winter or while awaiting political events, weddings, or decisions from the church courts. All expenses, food, service, firewood, bedding, servants, were covered by the host. No bills were given. No thanks were offered. It was expected. And that prolonged presence eroded the remaining peace in castles already plagued by bedbugs, rats, rancid smells, and internal tensions. One guest might arrive, bringing an entourage of 15 to 20, guards, servants, scribes, private priests, and sometimes even hunting dogs. Each one required a bed, food, blankets, and held the right to demand as if they were the owners. A guest wasn't just a guest, they were eyes, rivals, threats. Hospitality wasn't just a material burden, it was a political risk. In an age of schemes, betrayal, and tension over dinner, hosting a guest meant housing someone who might be spying on you. There were no private rooms, no secrets. Every word could be overheard. Every action could be reported back to the court. Sometimes guests came not to rest, but to gather complaints, or to measure the wealth and strength of your estate. And you couldn't refuse. You couldn't ask them to leave. All you could do was smile, pour wine, bow your head, and pray they left soon. The old guest hadn't left, and with word of mouth as the main form of communication, castles became unwilling rest stops for travelers, wandering nobles, merchants, or pilgrim groups. Each group stayed a few days, eating, resting, warming themselves, then moved on. Hosts sometimes couldn't tell guest from stranger. Servants were exhausted, firewood ran low, the pantry dwindled. Women in the castle, some freshly postpartum, had no time to recover before hosting began again. Noise stretched into the night. No one slept. No one dared complain. Children and women, the ones who suffered most. Noble children, already lacking private space, were pushed out of rooms when guests arrived, forced to sleep with staff, guards, or by the kitchen hearth. They weren't allowed to cry, run, or make noise. Guests needed rest. Women in the castle, whether ladies or servants, had to remain presentable at all times, serving wine, playing music, dancing, smiling, keeping up the family's reputation. Whether tired, menstruating, or pregnant, they had to perform as if it were a sacred duty. Everyone in the castle suddenly became actors in an endless play, where the guest was the center, and they were the backdrop. When hospitality is no longer human kindness, but a forced mechanism. Hospitality, in the medieval context, was not kindness, but obligation. It was something that, if not performed, would be seen as weakness, a social trap that forced people to pretend to be friendly, even when they felt sick inside. No one taught you how to refuse a guest. No one taught you how to protect your boundaries. There was only one way: endure, tolerate, and hope they leave soon of the castle. Nothing was truly yours. We've already known about the cold rooms filled with lice and rats, the spoiled meals, the unsanitary childbirths, and the human stench of months without bathing. Now add to that the constant chatter and laughter of strangers through the night, sleeping in your bed, drinking your wine, eating your bread, and leaving without a word of thanks. A castle was no paradise. It was a hostel where the lights never went out. It was an unwilling inn for honored guests, never invited. In a world without electricity, without flashlights, without switches or alarms, fire was the only source of light, and also the most dangerous element in a medieval castle. Candles, torches, fireplaces, kitchen fires, all carried the risk of burning everything down in an instant. And because most castles were built with a mix of wood and stone, a fire could start from a fallen candle, a stray ember, or an unattended hearth. In the thick darkness and wind slipping through cracks in the stone walls, a single spark could become a disaster. But people still had to live in those conditions because they had no other choice. Fire traps within the home. Unlike what movies portray, castles were not sealed blocks of cold stone. To keep warm, people used wooden floors, laid straw, hung thick tapestries and curtains, and built beds and kitchens with wood. All of those materials highly flammable. A single tipped candle could ignite the bed canopy, then the tablecloth, then the fur coats, then the woolen carpets, and no one could stop it in time. There were no fire suppression systems, no pressurized water hoses, no alarms. When fire broke out, people had only wooden buckets, leather pails, or their own cloaks to fight it. And when wind blew through the wall cracks, the flames spread faster, carrying smoke into bedrooms, corridors, and cellars. Many didn't die from fire itself, but from suffocation. Crowded space, too many guests, unexpected fire. Remember from the previous sections, the castle had no private space, always filled with guests, servants, guards, children, and heaps of flammable fabrics. A typical castle could house over 100 people crammed together. And in such a setting, every small action carried potential danger. Someone dozing off by a candle, a child playing with a torch, a gust of wind blowing through the cracks in the stone wall, fanning the flames, a silk curtain brushing the hearth. Just one careless moment, enough to turn the entire castle to ash. Not just fire. Everything was an accident waiting to happen. Accidents in medieval castles happened every day, every hour. No handrails on stairs, no anti-slip floors, no lights to guide the way at night. Moving in darkness meant many broke legs, cracked their skulls, or fell from upper levels. The kitchen brimmed with hot coals, flour dust, sharp knives, and boiling oil. Children played nearby. It was not rare for them to suffer severe burns or die from absurd accidents. The wine cellar and food storage, damp, slippery places, were death traps. Many fell down slick stairs, were crushed by barrels, or simply slipped and died in the dark, unnoticed. Women and children, the most vulnerable victims. Women in castles often wore long gowns, highly flammable fabric, layers of silk and lace, elegant attire but dangerously unsafe near open flame. Many fires started from a hem catching fire, flaring up violently before anyone could react. Children, already lacking their own beds or private spaces, slept near fireplaces or stoves to stay warm. This made them more vulnerable than anyone. Old chronicles contain countless accounts of children falling into hearths, burning alive in the night, or suffocating from smoke drifting down from upper floors. But in those days, it was merely misfortune. No one questioned fire safety, no one thought about child protection. Fire, not just the loss of a home, but of honor. When a castle burned, it wasn't just the loss of property, it was the loss of face. Nobles lived for reputation. A fire, even accidental, could be seen as a bad omen, a punishment from God, a failure of leadership. Some families collapsed after a single fire. Some lords committed suicide under the weight of disgrace. The castle was a symbol of power, and when it crumbled in flame, all prestige burned with it. Famous fires, lessons no one remembered. In European history, there were hundreds of major fires in castles, monasteries, and fortresses, many sparked by candles, straw, or bakery ovens. Some killed dozens in mere hours. But the terrifying truth, nothing truly changed afterward. No architectural improvements, no safety regulations, no firefighting equipment. Because medieval people didn't understand fire the way we do today, to them it was fate, the wrath of the divine. Choose to live in fire, because there was no other way. You might ask, why didn't they put out the fire faster? Why weren't they more careful? But remember, this was an age without choices. They needed fire for warmth, because the stone was cold enough to freeze a person to death. They needed a hearth to cook, because spoiled food had to be boiled thoroughly. They needed candles for light, because the darkness was thick as ink and could cause fatal falls. They knew fire was dangerous, but without fire, death came anyway. Day after day, night after night, living in a constant, silent fear. There were no fire prevention systems, no fire brigade, no insurance. When a fire broke out, you had only minutes to save yourself, your family, and perhaps your family's reputation. Even in sleep, people feared a flicker of flame could be the start of disaster. Servants took turns on night watch. Guards checked every corridor. But all of it was just a fragile hope against an accidental blaze. In many imaginations, the lives of medieval nobles were luxurious, powerful, and free. They lived in grand castles, had servants, wore crowns, and commanded armies. But behind that mask of authority was a truth few saw. They were profoundly lonely. Power didn't liberate them, it imprisoned them in an invisible cell. Each day, they wore the mask of their rank, lived by etiquette, ate with formality, spoke in set phrases, and thought within the roles society prescribed. No space for weakness. No room for a genuine sigh. The castle wasn't a home. It was an iron cage of power. Stone walls, keeping enemies out but trapping the master within. Castles were built to repel invaders, protect dynasties, and display power. But in doing so, they turned those inside into prisoners. Enemies might never arrive, but isolation was constant. They couldn't go anywhere alone. They couldn't step outside freely. Every outing required escorts, plans, and approval from councils or royalty. Even sitting by a river, letting the breeze drift through one's thoughts, was a luxury. A peasant might be poor, but they could run barefoot across fields, sit beneath a tree, soak their feet in a stream. But a noble, stepping outside the castle, carried the weight of honor, the threat of attack, or the shadow of assassination. No freedom, only duty. From birth, a noble no longer belonged to themselves. Their life belonged to the family, the estate, the duty to produce heirs or preserve power. They could not choose who to love. Marriage was a negotiation. They could not choose a profession. Every role was predetermined, lord, general, or princess to be married off. They could not decide their life, only fulfill the role assigned. As for commoners, they might have little education, little money, but they could love who they wanted, marry who they chose, and work with their own hands. Freedom lies not in power, but in the right to choose. Alone in a crowd, the greatest loneliness. Inside the castle, a noble was never truly alone, yet never truly understood. Surrounded by servants, guards, envoys, advisors, priests, and tutors, but none were friends. No one dared speak truth. No one cried with them. No one asked if they were truly well. They were surrounded by voices, yet heard no sincere words. Surrounded by people, yet no one knew what they were thinking. And the most frightening thing was they themselves forgot who they really were. No right to weakness. No right to sadness. If a nobleman sat in silence too long, people would say he was planning war. If a lady wept at night, rumors would spread about her marriage. No one was allowed to be weak. No one was allowed to be sad. No one was allowed to be real. Even when a child died, the grief had to be restrained. When love went unreturned, the disappointment had to be hidden behind velvet and candlelight. The most natural emotions became burdens, to be concealed by power. Isolation numbs the sense of humanity. Power closes the heart. Living too long in rituals, schemes, and calculations, many nobles lost the ability to feel others. They doubted everything, trusted no one, could no longer believe even in themselves. Every action became strategy. Every relationship became an alliance. And in a cold stone chamber, beneath heavy velvet drapes and flickering candlelight, a lord who once struck down hundreds of enemies sat in silence, no longer knowing who truly loved him, or if anyone remembered him as a person, and not just a title. The higher the castle, the deeper the darkness. It was no coincidence that many kings, queens, and lords turned cruel, cold, or paranoid. It was the result of prolonged isolation, combined with the pressure of lineage, faith, and duty that slowly erased their ability to feel their own true emotions. They demanded absolute loyalty because they couldn't tell who would betray them. They imposed harsh laws because they feared losing control. They executed those who doubted them because they feared abandonment. Power does not make people stronger. It only forces them to pretend to be strong for so long that they no longer realize when they've already collapsed. Letters never sent. Confessions never spoken. Among the remnants of the medieval age are torn diary pages, unsent letters. They are the only places where those once bowed to by entire kingdoms dared to admit they were sad. They were sad. They were tired. They wanted to disappear. A duchess once wrote, "I only want a forest, a coarse cloak, and someone who doesn't know who I am." A lord once recorded, "In the dark I hear the wind, and I wish I were it." These words were never read in public, but they exist as proof that even the most powerful are still human, and humans need to live truthfully. A yearning for freedom, but chains remain invisible. Many nobles gave up their thrones in their final years, retreating to monasteries, not out of virtue, but because they could no longer endure the isolation. There, they could be silent without suspicion, pray without mockery, live a simple life, at least for themselves. But not everyone had that chance. Most died in their own castles, not from war, but from the slow decay within their souls. So, after journeying through the cold stone walls, the filth, the fear, and the quiet resilience of medieval castle life, what do you think? Was it what you imagined, or perhaps darker than you ever expected? Let us know your thoughts. Did anything surprise you, disturb you, or make you see the Middle Ages in a different light? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, don't forget to send in your goodnight wishes. We always love reading them.